I glanced over and saw him rubbing her back, like I wasn't even there. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. It was like they thought I'd never notice, like I'd never understand. But in that one look, I knew exactly what was going on. Listen to what happened next. It wasn't a sudden thing, really. In fact, it took me months to piece together that something was wrong, let alone figure out what. The changes in her were subtle at first, easy to brush off as normal ups and downs. We'd been married a while, and things inevitably shift over time. But this was different. By the start of the year, it was as if she drifted to some distant shore, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach her. She began to pull back from me in small ways that felt more like tiny pricks than red flags. She'd brush off my hand if I reached to hold hers while we watched TV or sidestep a hug when I'd come home from work. At first, I told myself she was just stressed, maybe going through something personal. I even wondered if it could be menopause. It seemed plausible, and I was ready to be there for her if that was the case. But whenever I'd ask if something was bothering her, she'd just give a half-hearted shrug or say she was fine, her face barely even meeting my eyes. Things only got worse as the months passed. Physical affection, something we'd never struggled with, dwindled to almost nothing. When I tried to cuddle her in bed or even rest my hand on her shoulder, she'd recoil or give a subtle, irritated look. It was like she couldn't stand to be touched, and I was too hurt to keep trying. There we were, living under the same roof, but I felt as though we were worlds apart. I brought it up in therapy, too. My love language had always been touch, small gestures of affection that made me feel connected. But now it felt like a one-way street, like I was pouring out love and getting nothing back. I tried to convince myself that this was just a rough patch, something every couple goes through. But deep down, I felt the sting of loneliness more keenly each day, as if I was clinging to a shadow that had already slipped away. By the time summer arrived, it was clear that I couldn't ignore it anymore. As Christmas approached, I held on to the hope that maybe the holiday season could bring us closer again. We had always spent Christmas with my family in my hometown, a tradition I looked forward to every year. It meant a lot to me, especially now, after 2 years of not seeing my family. I imagined the cozy gatherings, the dinners, and reconnecting with my parents and friends, hoping that this trip could bring a fresh start for us. A couple of weeks before, I casually mentioned booking flights. That's when she dropped it on me, almost nonchalantly, as if it were no big deal. She'd already booked her holiday time off, but for the week after Christmas. For a moment, I just stared at her, feeling like I'd misheard. After Christmas? I repeated, waiting for her to realize the problem. We'd planned to be there for Christmas. It's been years since I saw my family. She barely looked up, just shrugged, and said it was easier that way. No apology, no understanding, just a complete dismissal of our plans, like they meant nothing to her. She muttered something about her work schedule, but it was so half-hearted I could tell it wasn't even true. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what was happening. She was doing this on purpose, finding any excuse to sabotage the trip and my chance to see my family. I took a deep breath, swallowing down the frustration. "Can't you change the dates?" I asked as calmly as I could, though I could feel my voice shake a bit. "It's been 2 years since we spent Christmas there." Her response was a reluctant, exaggerated sigh, like I was the one being difficult. "I'll see what I can do," she said dismissively, still glued to her phone, not even sparing me a glance. I could tell right then that she had no intention of changing her plans. She seemed more than willing to put a wedge between me and my family, and for the first time, it truly hit me that she didn't care how much it mattered to me. She'd sabotaged it on purpose, and her indifference felt like a slap in the face. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it, but the feeling lingered, solidifying in a way that was hard to ignore. A few days later, we got an invite to a dinner party, but it came in a way that instantly struck me as strange. We'd been friends with this couple for years, and they typically sent out invitations well in advance, especially for gatherings around the holidays. But this time, it was almost as if we'd been an afterthought. She told me about it only a couple of days before, mentioning it casually like it didn't matter whether we went or not. I tried to brush off the oddness of the timing, but it just didn't sit right with me. Something felt off, like the invitation was supposed to be just for her, and I'd been reluctantly added to the guest list at the last minute. That strange feeling followed me as we got ready to go, hanging heavy in the air as she prepared with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in months. I could tell she was eager to go, but not exactly for us to go together. When we arrived, the atmosphere was warm and familiar, yet I couldn't shake that sense of unease. People greeted us kindly, but there was something in their faces, like an underlying surprise that I was there. They exchanged glances I couldn't quite interpret. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things, reading too much into the night. But the more I watched her, the more my suspicions grew. As the night went on, she seemed to naturally gravitate toward one particular friend of hers, a guy I'd known for a while but had always felt uneasy around. They'd talk in low voices, leaning in close, laughing at little things no one else seemed to hear. It felt like everyone in the room saw it, but no one said a word. I tried to join in their conversations, but they'd quickly shift the subject, keeping me at arm's length like I didn't belong. That feeling, that nagging suspicion, kept building. As I sat there, sipping my drink, I began to wonder if they'd hoped I wouldn't come at all. I started to feel like an outsider, a guest at my own wife's gathering, watching her slip further away with every passing hour. It was well past midnight, and most of the guests had already left. Just a handful of us remained, sitting around the dining table, talking and laughing in that relaxed way that late-night conversations tend to go. I was engaged in some small talk with another guest when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed her and that friend of hers seated close together on the other side of the table. The way they leaned in toward each other, the shared glances, the private smiles, it all felt too intimate, too familiar. And then I saw it. His hand rested on her back, fingers moving slowly, tracing small circles in a way that seemed natural to him, like it wasn't the first time. It wasn't a friendly pat or a casual touch, it was something deeper, more deliberate. She didn't flinch or pull away. She just sat there, allowing it as if they were alone. They were so absorbed in each other, so at ease, that it felt like they'd forgotten I was even there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. I wanted to say something, to call them out right then and there. But instead, I just watched, trying to process what I was seeing. It was one thing to feel the distance between us, to sense something was wrong, but seeing it confirmed right in front of me was like a punch to the gut. They were acting like a couple, plain and simple, without any regard for how obvious it looked or the fact that I was sitting right across from them. I looked away, trying to focus on the conversation I'd been having, but I couldn't hear a word anyone was saying. The image of his hand on her back was burned into my mind, as clear as day. In that moment, I knew I hadn't been imagining things all those months. The affection she'd withdrawn from me, the constant excuses and distance, all of it now made perfect sense. They must have thought I wouldn't notice, that I was oblivious. But as I sat there in silence, I knew with absolute certainty what was happening. Inside, I felt something shift, like a part of me had finally snapped. There was no doubt anymore, no excuses to cling to. Whatever I'd been holding onto, hoping to fix or repair, was gone. I was done pretending that everything was fine. When we got home, I felt a numb determination to confront her. I didn't want to drag it out with some argument or endless back and forth, but I also couldn't just let it slide. The sight of that man's hand on her back was still vivid, and I knew I needed to bring it up, even if just to see her reaction. She seemed unfazed as we walked inside, moving around the house with her usual indifference, as if nothing had happened. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "So, it looked like you and your friend were getting pretty cozy tonight," I said quietly, trying to keep my tone even. I watched her closely, hoping for some flash of guilt, maybe a hint of regret or even an explanation. But she just stopped, looking at me with that same blank expression. "What are you talking about?" she asked, barely hiding her irritation, as if I'd accused her of something trivial. "You know what I mean," I pressed, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "He was rubbing your back in a way that felt more than friendly." I wanted to give her a chance, a moment to admit to something, to own up to what I'd seen. But instead of responding, she just rolled her eyes, looking away with an annoyed sigh. For a moment, she hesitated, and I saw a flash of something in her eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of acknowledgement, like she knew exactly what I was talking about, but didn't care enough to hide it. It was as if she'd been caught, but felt no need to explain herself. She just stared at me, her face a mask of indifference, like she was merely tolerating my questions. "No, he wasn't," she finally said, her voice flat, dismissive. That's when it hit me like a cold wave. She wasn't going to apologize, she wasn't going to admit anything, and she didn't even feel the need to lie convincingly. Her lack of remorse, the sheer indifference in her expression, told me everything I needed to know. At that moment, I realized just how little she cared about how her actions affected me. She wasn't just denying it, she was refusing to even acknowledge that it mattered. I felt the last bit of hope dissolve, replaced by a quiet, hollow certainty that there was nothing left to save. Whatever we'd once had, whatever I'd been clinging to, was gone. Her actions had killed it, and there was nothing left for me here. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. I'd been holding on, hoping that there was something left between us that could be repaired, that maybe this was just a phase or a misunderstanding. But that brief, indifferent look on her face had crushed any illusions I'd held. She didn't feel regret, and she didn't see any reason to be accountable. Whatever we'd had, she'd already let go of it, and I realized I had to do the same. A strange sense of calm came over me as I lay there, piecing together all the moments that had led to this. The distance, the unexplained absences, the coldness, all of it made sense now. I felt foolish for ignoring the signs for so long, for letting myself believe that it could all be fixed. But now, I wasn't sad or angry. I was simply done. As the hours passed in that quiet darkness, I felt a kind of relief. For the first time, I could see the way forward clearly, and it didn't include her. I didn't need to keep trying, didn't need to keep searching for answers or justifying her behavior. I knew what I needed to know, and with that knowledge came a sense of freedom. I could feel a weight lifting off me, a burden I'd carried for far too long. I'd exhausted myself trying to hold on to someone who had already let go. Now, I didn't have to keep pretending, keep hoping for some miracle that would never come. It was time to accept the truth and take the first steps toward leaving this life behind. By the time dawn started to break, I'd made my decision. I'd move forward, rebuild, and find peace on my own terms. I didn't know exactly what that would look like, but I knew it was time to reclaim my life and let go of a relationship that no longer existed. The next morning, I felt oddly calm, as if the decision to end things had unlocked a part of me that had been trapped for months. I went through the motions of my day, but everything felt sharper, clearer, like I was finally seeing the situation without the fog of denial. She moved around the house with her usual indifference, barely noticing me. It was almost surreal. She had no idea that I'd made up my mind, that I was already planning my exit. We spoke little that day. At one point, I brought up our Christmas plans again, a final check to see if she would even bother making an excuse this time. Predictably, she gave me the same vague responses, the same lackluster interest, as though the holiday trip to see my family was some trivial inconvenience. I didn't push, there was no point anymore. I already knew she wouldn't go through with it, that something would come up last minute, another excuse to avoid spending the holidays together. As the days passed, I started putting things in place quietly, making arrangements to move on with as little disruption as possible. I went over finances, checked on paperwork, and mentally prepared myself for what I'd come to call D-Day. I knew there was no room for argument or emotional pleas. I didn't need to prove anything to her, and I certainly didn't owe her any more explanations. This time, I would leave on my terms, with my dignity intact. There was a strange satisfaction in the planning, a feeling of control I hadn't felt in a long time. Every little step felt like a piece of my freedom returning, like I was slowly reclaiming the life I'd let slip away. I imagined the moment I would finally tell her, the look on her face when she realized I was done, truly done, and for once, she wouldn't be the one holding the cards. The moment finally came one evening as we were going through our usual routine. She was watching TV, half distracted on her phone, barely acknowledging I was even there. I realized there would be no perfect time, no ideal way to say it, so I just took a breath, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. I stood in front of her, forcing her to look up from her phone. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked at me, a hint of irritation in her eyes, like she'd been interrupted. For a second, I almost hesitated, but then all the months of coldness, the distance, the betrayal, all of it came flooding back, fueling my resolve. "It's over," I said plainly. "I can't do this anymore." She blinked, stunned, as if she hadn't expected me to follow through. For a moment, she just stared, her expression blank, like she was trying to process what I'd said. Then came the deflection, the predictable attempt to make it my fault. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice dripping with indifference. "You're overreacting." I felt a wave of anger rise, but quickly pushed it back down. "I'm done waiting for things to change, done pretending this is a marriage. I know what's been going on. And I'm finished." The look on her face shifted, not to sadness or even guilt, but to annoyance. She muttered something about me being paranoid or overly sensitive, refusing to acknowledge her part in any of it. I could see that she wasn't even willing to meet me halfway. She didn't care enough to even try to defend herself. There was no tearful argument, no emotional pleas. She simply shrugged, as though I'd announced I was leaving for a weekend trip instead of ending our life together. That reaction hit me harder than any shouting match ever could have. In that moment, her lack of care, the complete indifference in her eyes, confirmed that leaving was the only choice I had left. I turned, walked away from her, and felt a heavy weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. In the days that followed, a strange mix of sadness and relief settled over me. I moved out and started the slow process of rebuilding, of figuring out what my life would look like without her. It was bittersweet, ending a life I'd invested so much in, but each day, I felt a little more like myself. The loneliness I dreaded felt almost like a welcome silence after all the emotional noise. I reached out to close friends and family, people who had been there for me without even knowing the whole story. Their support was unwavering, and it helped pull me through those first raw weeks. My parents, who I hadn't visited because of her excuses, were thrilled just to hear my voice more regularly. I realized I'd been living with blinders on, sacrificing my happiness for someone who barely valued it. Even her family reached out, apologizing for the way things had ended, offering their support. I was overwhelmed by how many people were there for me, more than I'd ever realized. When I returned to gather the last of my things, I was almost surprised by how little she reacted. She barely looked up as I packed my belongings, like I was some stranger. That indifference stung, but it was also the closure I needed. I could see now, more clearly than ever, that she had let go long before I had. And finally, I was okay with that. In the months that followed, I focused on healing, rediscovering parts of myself I'd put aside. Therapy helped me navigate the grief, the frustration, the sense of betrayal, and slowly I began to feel whole again. I spent more time with friends, picked up old hobbies, and even started going to the gym, a small but significant step toward feeling in control again. There were hard days, of course, but I kept moving forward, one step at a time. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm finally free from a life that no longer served me. The experience taught me more than I wanted to know about betrayal, but it also taught me the importance of valuing myself. For the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful. It's a new beginning, and although the scars are still there, I feel ready to start living again, this time for myself.